Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in the series on the death of the Army of Tennessee, which we recorded in October of 1995. This particular lecture focuses on one of the premier personalities of the Western Army. We've already talked about Nathan Bedford Forrest in another lecture with Brian Wills, who is a biographer. In this, we have another biographer, Craig Symonds. At the time, Craig was professor of history at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, and he had written several outstanding books and is a naval historian par excellence. Pat Cleburne interested him like he did so many other people, and Craig was just finishing a biography of Pat Cleburne at the time, and of course Cleburne is killed at the Battle of Franklin, and there so many of the what ifs of the war. What if Cleburne had been made a Corps commander? Would this have been as bad? What if Cleburne had commanded an army? Well, you know, what woulda, coulda, shoulda always works for the armchair quarterbacks, which I suppose we all are now. But in understanding things, Cleburne was a young man from Arkansas. He had his own views of things. He and Thomas Carmichael Heineman were attorneys in Arkansas. They weren't professional soldiers. They just saw things the way they saw them. Cleburne had become kind of persona non grata despite his tremendous fighting bona fides. He had made a suggestion that perhaps the Army would be well advised, and the Confederacy would be well advised, to arm slaves and put them in the Army and let them fight. He had made this recommendation in the winter of 1864, and it caused him no end of grief. No doubt ended his career advancement possibilities, and the recommendation was buried by Joseph E. Johnston and others because of its controversial and emotional nature. And so when Craig decided to come out with a biography that was not a hagiography, in other words, not fawning over every aspect of Cleburne, he came on the Heinz quarters of the standard biography at the time was put out by people by the name of Purdue on Pat Cleburne, and that book is still very popular with the Cleburne crowd. Craig's biography, because he was somewhat critical and not fawning over Cleburne, found a very unwelcoming audience when it came out. The book remains in print and paperback on his biography of Cleburne, and I think on the whole is a fair book. But at the time, Cleburne was a hero and remained and remains to this day one of the heroes of the Confederacy, and one of the people that they always Confederate aficionados always play the what if game. What if he had done this? What if he had gotten this? What if he had gotten that? So Craig's job was really a lot tougher than it might appear on the surface, and I believe I haven't watched this whole thing through, but I believe he probably gets a few tough questions at the end from people who are admirers of Pat Cleburne. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Craig Symonds' presentation on Pat Cleburne, hero of or rebel and patriot.
Mary Lou was just a couple, 3 years ago, I think it was, in Richmond at the American Blue and Gray Association's first annual convention. His talk was succinct, it was crisp, and he had an awful lot to say, and I said, that's a learned man. If I ever had a chance to work with him again, I was going to do so, and fortunately I found out that he was in the process of working on a biography of Pat Cleburne, which I understand is ready to go to the printers pretty soon, early part of '96, should be on the streets in 1997. If it is like any of his other works before, it's going to be wonderful. And just as a measure of that, to tell you that Craig's book on Joe E. Johnston was the second place. I wish I could say it was the winner, but it was the second place runner-up in the $50,000 Best Civil War Prize of the Year, Best Civil War Book of the Year for the Lincoln Prize just a couple of years ago. It is high-level scholarship indeed. So it gives me a very great deal of pleasure to introduce to you a very good scholar and a fine man, Craig Symonds.
What an introduction. Thanks.
God, wait, okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot, by the way, for the scheduling here. Not only do I have to follow 3 superb talks this morning, but I have to follow that lunch as well. But I'll do my best. I should mention, I suppose, that the Lincoln Prize, the way it's arranged, it's $50,000 for first place and a handshake for second. It's a great honor, but that's about all, I'm afraid. I am working on a biography of Pat Cleburne, and I conceived of this several years ago. A number of my students found him particularly interesting, as I did, and tried to figure out what exactly were the components of this man, what made him tick. And I wondered why the idea of doing a comprehensive biography on Pat Cleburne had gone begging for so long. There is one other book, one biography of Cleburne, as some of you, maybe most of you already know. It was written by the husband and wife team of Howell and Elizabeth Perdue. He was a now retired judge in Virginia. And they spent years putting this together. They tracked down the smallest bits of information that they could about his life. Their book is subtitled A Definitive Biography. And if in terms of actually collecting all of the letters, documents, and so forth that have anything to do with Pat Cleburne, it is in fact definitive. It is what I would call an encyclopedic treatment of Pat Cleburne, but alas, it is not really a true biography. We know an awful lot about what he did. It's still very difficult to determine who he was, and that's why I became involved in this project. I think one reason why no true biography of Cleburne exists, at least yet, is that the sparse historical material that does exist leaves most of the crucial questions about him unanswered. What was in his inner thoughts? What fears did he have when he crossed the Atlantic in 1849 as an immigrant to the United States from Ireland at the age of 21? What did he think of his neighbors in Helena, Arkansas when he moved there in 1850? A struggling young druggist and would-be attorney. What ambitions did he have? What did he think about in the middle of the night when he was all alone and thinking about his future? What worries did he have? And in his many battles, when he was, as always, in the absolute front rank of his command, did he overcome his fears? Or was he truly, genuinely, literally fearless? Then, too, there is the whole element of Pat Cleburne in terms of his relationship to the South's peculiar institution. Or one of the most interesting aspects of his life was his proposal to arm the South's black slaves and bring them into the Confederate Army, offering in exchange for their service their freedom. It was, as far as he could see, the only practical route to overcoming the North's obvious manpower advantage. Cleburne was not a slave owner, never owned a slave. He was a foreigner who had lived in America, in Arkansas, for barely a decade. And apparently he genuinely believed that the South would willingly surrender the institution of slavery in order to achieve its independence, which was, I think, a measure of both Southern patriotism and a large element of naivete on his part. But all of these issues, which must lie at the heart of any true biography, are difficult to assess with any high degree of confidence because Cleburne left so few personal letters behind. He was a bachelor. So he wrote no letters home, pouring out his inner thoughts to a loving wife, as so many Civil War veterans did. He did not develop any serious romantic relationship really until the last few months of his life. Of course, he had no idea at the time that they would be the last few months of his life. But even then, the letters that he wrote to Sue Tarleton in Mobile, they do not exist. She probably destroyed all of them after his death. There's one or two that he wrote to a friend describing that relationship, but almost one-pagers, very short, don't really give you the kind of insight you need to climb inside the skull of someone and look out through his eyes, which is what a biographer tries to do. He had no really close friends outside the Army, or at least none that he wrote regularly to. He was a private man, and the letters that he did write offer only tiny glimpses into his inner self. He did apparently keep a diary. Several contemporary witnesses recall him writing in it. Even the day he died, he sat on a stump on Breezy Hill and made some entries into a diary. But that diary, along with his watch and his boots, was stripped from his body by some unknown battlefield ghoul as he lay 60 yards short of the Federal line at Franklin. I doubt that it will ever be found, and I strongly suspect that were it to be found, we would find that it contained not, again, his inner thoughts, his inner feelings, but rather more like a book of memoranda, appointments to be kept, things to be considered. We might learn more about what he did day to day, but perhaps no more than we know now about who he was. There are, of course, the memoirs that were written by Cleburne's friends, his comrades in arms. These are probably about as close as we can get now to having a first-hand account of Cleburne. And there are three that are particularly useful. The earliest is one that was written by Cleburne's chief of staff, a San Francisco lawyer named Calhoun Benham. It was published in the Kennesaw Gazette, a now defunct publication, in 20 installments beginning in January of 1889. A decade after that, Dr. Charles Nash, who was Cleburne's closest friend, his patron, advisor, and partner in the pharmaceutical shop in Helena, Arkansas, wrote a memoir of Cleburne. This one is particularly fun because Nash goes out of his way to offer a number of personal anecdotes that add flesh to the skeleton of Cleburne as an individual. On the other hand, I've also discovered that Nash, who really only knew Cleburne during that one decade when he lived in Helena, often adds a bit more flesh than is warranted. Some of these anecdotal tales that he tells cannot be verified, and I strongly suspect that he's making a few of them up. That book, by the way, is still in print. It was rescued by Bob Younger, as so many older books were, in Morningside Press, and is still available in a hardback edition. Finally, the best-known memoir of Cleburne is the one that was written by his aide, Captain Irving Buck, who was only 22 at the time and wrote down his ideas many years later. It was published in 1908 and under the heading of Cleburne and His Division, and subsequently reprinted with a lengthy introduction by Thomas Robeson Hay. And once again, Buck's memoir needs to be used with some care because he was not with Cleburne continuously throughout the war. He was not, for example, with Cleburne at Spring Hill or Franklin, though that does not prevent him from offering a chapter on those events in his memoir. Well, alas, none of these first-hand accounts are really contemporary accounts. Part of Benham's memoir may have been written at the same time as the events that are described, and there's some second-hand evidence that Cleburne may have been had an opportunity to read and comment on some of the notes that Benham took, so it's almost a first-hand account. But for the most part, these were compiled after the war. In Buck's case, nearly a half-century after the war, and as such, they are as much testimonials to Cleburne as they are testimony. And so we have to be at least a bit suspicious that the authors after the fact at least, may be gilding the lily. Finally, then, there are Cleburne's own official reports. Now, anyone in this room who has used the OR, and I suspect that includes most of us, knows how unsatisfying those battlefield reports can sometimes be. But Cleburne was a particularly good writer of reports. He wrote well, and he did not hesitate to go beyond a mere descriptive account of what took place. He took pride in what he wrote. He thought of them, I think, in his own mind almost as literature, as well as reports. There's one entry, Captain Thomas Q, commanded a battery in Cleburne's division, notes in his own diary he was walking by Cleburne's tent, and the commanding general came out and called him in. He said, "Sit down, I want you to listen to this," and read him aloud a long passage from his battlefield account on Ringgold Gap, obviously taking a great deal of pride not only in what happened at Ringgold Gap, which would be justified, but in the way he described what happened at Ringgold Gap. So Cleburne's official reports are a bit more useful than those of most officers, but even so, as a window into a man's soul, official reports are almost never fully satisfying. In some men, what we have are a handful of letters, no more than half a dozen private letters, mostly from the early 1850s. The post-war reminiscences of Cleburne's friends and admirers, and his own official reports. Not a lot to go on. And this poses a dilemma for a would-be biographer, such as myself. On the one hand, I can report Cleburne's record of activity accurately, filling in the gaps as best I can with observations made by his contemporaries, or try to gain a sense of the man from those fragments of personal glimpses and use historical imagination to construct a three-dimensional, living, breathing portrait of an historical figure. Now, the latter here is obviously far more interesting and also far more dangerous, for it requires the author to make some leaps of faith, to speculate, to couch some of his conclusions in phrases such as these. He must have felt, or almost certainly, he wondered if, no doubt he agonized about this decision. This is boggy ground for an historian, and for the past couple of years I've been treading rather carefully on it. In the end, however, all biographies are portraits of individuals as they are seen by their biographers. So what I'm going to offer is a glimpse of Cleburne as I have come to see him. And you can listen for those phrases like, "he must have thought," to determine when I'm offering my own speculations. The title of the talk that's listed in the program for today, by the way, was Len's Idea. I didn't know this was the title of it until I got a copy of the program in the mail. I looked at that. Let's see, Pat Cleburne, Soldier, Rebel, Patriot. Hey, not bad. I thought I might as well go ahead and use that as kind of an organizing outline, but I'd like to change the order. How about Pat Cleburne, Rebel, Soldier, Patriot? Pat Cleburne, Rebel. Was he a rebel? He was certainly a committed and enthusiastic member of the rebel army. He was, in addition, a strong-minded individual. And when he believed that someone had made an error, he said so, often without regard for the consequences. In fact, almost always without regard for the consequences. But he was not a rebel by nature. Rather, I think he was a man who wanted desperately to belong, to fit in. When he arrived in frontier Helena in 1850, then a rough and tumble frontier town of a population of no more than about 600, he assessed the values and mores of that society, and like ambitious immigrants anywhere and at any time, he adopted them. Self-reliance, personal loyalty, perseverance. These were the elements of success in frontier Helena, and Cleburne took them to heart. No doubt they were part of his character anyway, but Cleburne was sufficiently sensitive and sufficiently ambitious that he quickly determined what was likely to win the approval of his neighbors, and he set about establishing a place for himself. He joined the best church. He was one of those rare creatures, an Irish Protestant. So it was no great leap for him to join the socially acceptable Episcopalians. He aligned himself with the socially respectable Whigs, politically, the party of the well-to-do, though he eventually became a Democrat when the Whig Party broke apart. More about that later. He even became a Mason, rising rather quickly to become Royal Archmason and the principal speaker at the 1853 Masonic Convention. He worked hard to minimize his Irish accent and practiced in his room alone, according to Dr. Nash. He quit drinking when he found out that he was prone to conduct acts of foolishness while under the influence of drink, and desperate, I think, to avoid the caricature of the drunken Irishman. After making a success as a pharmacist, thanks in large part to the patronage of Dr. Nash, who was his business partner, he read law and became a trial lawyer specializing in land claims, which on the frontier was where the business was. He was, I'm afraid, a rather indifferent trial lawyer, often arguing a case on the basis of general fairness rather than the points of law, and his quick temper occasionally got him into trouble when the judge's decision went against him. You can almost picture him leaping up and say, "But Judge, that's not fair!" On the whole, however, Cleburne's rise to prominence in Helena, Arkansas was an archetypal American success story. Immigrant works hard, fits in, finds success. In its newspaper report on Cleburne's speech at that 1853 Masonic Convention, the local newspaper recounted that although the principal speaker was from over the water, he was, the paper said, thoroughly Americanized. No doubt Cleburne was pleased by that. No doubt. Cleburne's absorption of these local values, I think, also explains his commitment to the Confederate cause. Socially ambitious, professionally successful, he tended to move among those circles of Helena society that objected most strongly to the growing northern influence in government. The most notorious spokesman for the radical, fire-eating point of view in Arkansas was Thomas Hinman, who arrived in Helena in 1854 and made an immediate impact not only on the town, but on Cleburne as well. As personalities, they were as different as night and day. Cleburne was reserved, quiet, intense. Hinman was flamboyant, dramatic, overly dramatic, melodramatic. But what drew them together was their common opposition to the Know-Nothing movement in Arkansas. The collapse of the Whig Party in the mid-1850s created a political vacuum and gave the Know-Nothings their opportunity. It was a party defined almost exclusively by its opposition to immigration and to immigrants. For Cleburne, this was not only a pernicious doctrine, it was a personal threat. The Know-Nothings argued that immigrants should not be allowed to vote or to own land. When Hinman, leading Democrat, launched an attack on the Know-Nothings, Cleburne became his right-hand man. Once that threat was quashed with the Democratic victory in 1856, Cleburne pretty much retired from politics, but he remained Hinman's close friend. He stood by Hinman in a gunfight in the middle of Helena's dirt streets, and thus when Hinman became the leader of the pro-secessionist movement in Arkansas, Cleburne was swept along with him. He did not embrace the secessionist cause due to any conviction he had about the institution of slavery. "I have never owned a slave," he wrote to his brother Robert, who lived in Cincinnati at the time, in one of those few surviving personal letters. "I have never owned a slave, and I care nothing for them." Nor was it a particular commitment to the doctrine of states' rights. It was out of loyalty to his friends and his neighbors. "These people have been my friends," he wrote, "and have stood up to me," meaning for me, "on all occasions. It was not ideology, and it was not rebelliousness that made Cleburne a Confederate soldier. It was his sense of loyalty. I am with Arkansas in weal or woe." In the end, like many of his friends and neighbors, Cleburne went to war not as a rebel, but as a conservator. to preserve the culture and society that he had adopted and in which he had made a place for himself. If he was not a rebel by nature, he was unquestionably a soldier. Of course, he had been a soldier before. During the potato famine that devastated Ireland after 1845, he had journeyed to Dublin in the hopes of gaining admission to the apothecary school. He had worked as an assistant to an apothecary in Mallow, north of Cork, after his father's death when he was 15, and had worked in that capacity for 3 years, but now he thought he had a chance perhaps to become an apothecary himself. And in the midwinter of 1845-46, he took a carriage ride to Dublin. You can almost imagine this young man, 18 years old, depositing himself in the streets of Dublin and virtually knocking on the door of the apothecary school. Alas, he was not admitted. He had no knowledge of Latin. The private school where he had attended had not offered Latin. And unwilling to go back to the family home in County Cork, where in the midst of famine he thought he would be more of a burden than a help, he enlisted in the British Army. He did not like it. The British Army was hardly very popular in Ireland, no more so then than it is now, really. Especially since during the crisis of the famine, the Army's main job was to evict tenants and guard landlords, almost always British landlords and Irish tenants. Moreover, as an Irishman in the British Army, he would never have the opportunity to rise above the rank of sergeant, even if he stayed for 50 years. So 2.5 years later, when the chance came to buy his discharge, which he could do thanks to a small inheritance he received when he turned 21 from his mother's family, he bought his way out for 20 pounds and joined with 3 of his siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, in emigrating to America. I should mention as an aside that Cleburne was not a passenger in one of those tightly packed Irish death ships that plied the North Atlantic waters in 1846, 47, and 48. He and his siblings were sufficiently well off to purchase private cabins in a passenger ship. Cleburne was never one of the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. He was one of the privileged few seeking to get away from famine and disaster and seek new social and economic opportunities elsewhere. But the point here, as far as Cleburne's experience as a soldier is concerned, is that he had about 2.5 years, all but a month or 2 of it, as a private in the ranks. He was a corporal for about 6 weeks. And that provided him with little more than a knowledge of the manual of arms and a familiarity with drill. Still, those assets were quite useful when the planters' sons of Helena, Arkansas formed a rifle company in the crisis fall of 1860. They elected Cleburne their captain. When they were amalgamated with other volunteer companies from the area into the 1st Arkansas, later redesignated as the 15th Arkansas, he was elected their colonel. He was a brigadier general within a year and a major general 8 months later, a rank from which he was not again promoted despite an astonishing record of successful performance. And 2 questions have to pose themselves here. What made him so effective as to earn such rapid promotion early in the war, and what kept him from being promoted ever again once he reached divisional command? Cleburne was, as I mentioned, a very intense young man. I say young, he was 32 at the time he became brigadier general. I think most of us in this room would agree 32 is still relatively young. The same intensity he applied to his campaign of self-improvement in Helena, he applied to learning the new rules of his new job. He worked hard. He was extremely conscientious. He personally supervised all regimental drill. He turned out for battalion drill, and he attended almost all of the company drills. Quiet in his personal manner, intense in his work ethic, he inspired these same characteristics in his subordinates. He seldom interfered unless it was absolutely necessary. One story told about him, printed subsequently in the Confederate Veteran, which is a great source, by the way, for anecdotes of this nature. He was attending a battalion drill when he noticed that the major, who was in charge, kept the privates at attention while he gave instruction to non-commissioned officers. And he quietly turned to his aide and asked him to sidle up to the major and suggest that the men be put at ease while he was giving instructions. And that had no apparent impact. The men remained at attention and right shoulder shift. Then he called out in his loud voice, "Major, put the men in order arms when you give those instructions." And this brought a blush to the major's cheek, and the men in the ranks gave him kind of a whoop, you know, embarrassing as it would be. But this is the exception rather than the rule. Cleburne liked to command quietly. He was a quiet warrior. He was a strict disciplinarian who expected his officers, as well as his men, to work as hard as he did. But he was also on occasion a soft touch. Another story, one young captain came into his tent one night. In fact, it was when Cleburne was acting corps commander outside Chattanooga. The captain came in and went down to one knee and placed a piece of paper right under Cleburne's nose. Apparently it was the wrong thing to do. Cleburne took the back of his hand and whacked it out of the way and went drifting across the tent floor and settled on the ground. The captain, who was at first taken aback by this but determined to have his way, said, "You know, why won't you look at my paper?" And Cleburne turned on him and said, "It's a request for leave. Why you should go through channels. It's inappropriate you come directly to me like this," and so forth. And the captain says, "I admit all that you say, General. It's all true, but if I've been insubordinate, it's your fault." Well, confrontational words were bound to get Cleburne's attention, and it did. He said, "What do you mean my fault?" He said, "Well, I've been fighting by your side ever since the battlefield at Shiloh. I was close enough to you then to put my hand on your shoulder, and I've been with you every campaign since then, and I learned from you that the direct approach is often the best." Well, that got to his better nature, and Cleburne got up and began to pace up and down the tent. "Oh, yes, Shiloh. Wasn't that a magnificent confrontation? What a battle. Were there ever such brave men?" He stopped and he looked down and saw that piece of paper on the floor, and he picked it up and read it. The captain had asked for 3 days' leave to visit his 3-year-old daughter who was dying of typhoid fever. Cleburne sat down at his desk, signed his name to the bottom, and handed it to the captain, and went on his way. The captain said later, he said, I got what I wanted, but I felt like I'd been through a tougher battle than Shiloh." Well, these characteristics, hard work, attention to details, setting an example, compassion for his men, these were the things that made Cleburne a good leader. But they did not necessarily make him an effective commander. In fact, in Cleburne's early fights, he demonstrated that he had a great deal to learn about the effective management of modern combat. At Shiloh, for example, the thought of which made him get up and begin pacing around that tent. At Shiloh, he led a brigade of 5 regiments. For most of 2 days, he led them in repeated frontal assaults. Leading from the front, he demonstrated appalling personal courage, unmatched enthusiasm, but not much more. And his men paid the price. In the morning attack on 6th April, the 2 regiments where he commanded personally were all but annihilated. In a few hours, the 6th Mississippi lost 300 of its 425 men. That turned out to be, once all was said and done, the 4th highest percentage of loss by any unit in the entire war. By the end of the 2nd day, Cleburne personally commanded a total of 58 men of the 2,700 he had taken into battle the morning before. Though Hardee, in his official report, praised Cleburne for his persevering valor and conspicuous gallantry, Cleburne in the spring of 1862 was still more of a leader than he was a commander. But he learned. He noted how effective the Federal artillery had been at Shiloh and made the study of artillery a personal project. He came up with the idea of separate sharpshooter companies to pick off enemy gunners and organize special companies by shooting matches, issuing to them the most accurate weapons available. In the Kentucky campaign that fall, where he was twice personally wounded, and at Murfreesboro that winter, he was still persevering and still gallant, but he also applied what he had learned, and on both occasions his division proved to be the decisive unit on the battlefield. By the fall of 1863, at Tunnel Hill and North Missionary Ridge and at Ringgold Gap during the subsequent retreat, he had become arguably the best division commander in the Army, perhaps the best division commander in either Army. At Missionary Ridge, he held off Sherman's entire corps against odds of roughly 4-1, even while the Confederate center was breaking apart under pressure of what was supposed to have been a diversionary attack. A few days later, he held Ringgold Gap against another superior enemy force until the rest of the Army and its wagons could get safely away. These were the exploits that won him the title Stonewall of the West. If not a rebel, he was unquestionably a soldier, intensely committed to his responsibility, single-minded in his devotion to what he conceived of as his duty, and perhaps most important of all, able to learn from his experiences. That leaves us to deal with the question of Pat Cleburne as a patriot. It's a term he would have applied to himself without a moment's hesitation. Of course he was a patriot. He went to war with his friends and his neighbors. He worked diligently in the interest of his state. In the end, of course, he gave his life. Cleburne's brand of patriotism derived almost exclusively from his sense of belonging. He had no deep-seated ideological conviction about states' rights or the rightness of slavery as an institution. It was enough for him that his society was threatened. His suggestion in January of 1864 that the Confederacy should consider offering slaves their freedom in exchange for their service in the Confederate Army was to him a practical, pragmatic solution to a very evident problem. The Federal armies assailing the South were simply larger than those available to defend it. Where else but in the South's black population could the Confederacy find the human resources to even the odds? He thought the problem through over that winter of 63-64 and concluded that since the institution of slavery could really not be expected to survive if a large number of black slaves were set free by virtue of their service in the Army, that the consequences of this were simply quite clearly that slavery as an institution had to be abolished. He assumed that any patriotic Southerner would be willing to let slavery go to achieve independence. Was this patriotism or naivete? I think it was both. Though Cleburne discussed his idea with several general officers who claimed to approve of it in principle, he never fully understood that the notion was simply inconceivable in the Confederacy at large. At least it was inconceivable until there was no other option left. As many of you know, the Confederacy did eventually adopt the idea of armed blacks in the Confederate Army, thanks almost exclusively to Lee's prodding in the last weeks of the war. Even then, however, there was bitter opposition, and the idea would never have been tolerated at all had the end not been so evident, and for the inability of the Confederate government to say no to Robert E. Lee. Cleburne's patriotism, then, was not for an abstract idea or a question of principle. It was simply an extension of his personal loyalty to his friends, to his neighbors, to Arkansas. This, then, was the man whom John Bell Hood held to be, at least in part, guilty of the debacle at Spring Hill. To what extent was Cleburne responsible for the missed opportunities that night? To be sure, Hood, as Army commander, has to bear the ultimate responsibility. But did he give sufficiently clear orders to his subordinates, to Cheatham, to Cleburne, to Brown, to ensure that his orders were carried out? The official reports tell the story you already know. Hood claimed that he ordered Cheatham to attack and get possession of the pike. But were any such orders given to Cleburne? Cleburne, of course, left no official report of this campaign. He would not survive the campaign to write. The closest thing we have to an eyewitness account is an article written by learned Mangum many years later. Mangum was not only one of Cleburne's personal aides, he was also his close friend. He had been his law partner, an 1857 Princeton graduate, and Cleburne's law partner in Helena before the war, and at Cleburne's side through most of the war. He can hardly be considered, therefore, an unbiased source. Still, Mangum declared his determination to tell the exact truth in this article, claiming, to quote Mangum now, "I will write of and describe things as they actually occurred, and not as I picture them in my imagination." According to Mangum, Cleburne reached Spring Hill late in the afternoon. Quoting from his article now, General Hood, in person, ordered General Cleburne to form line of battle to the left of the road, then move forward and take the enemy's breastworks just over the brow of the hill. That was Bradley's brigade, which Ed showed us yesterday afternoon. In less than 15 minutes, Mangum says, Cleburne's men had executed the maneuver and chased the Yankees from their lines. At this point, Cleburne's division was about 200 yards from the pike and parallel to it. Here's what Mangum says happened next. Cleburne ordered me to direct General Granbury to form his brigade along a fence running parallel to the pike and about 200 yards from it, so as to be prepared to move on the pike, remarking at the time that he would see Govan personally. Just then, this is still quoted, just then a shell bursted over us and wounded Cleburne's horse, Red Pepper, in the hip. He reared furiously for a time. I assume he means the horse here, not Cleburne. And I remained a moment to see if the general was hurt. Upon asking him, I shall never forget his reply and manner, both showing how determined he was to hold the pike. No, no, go on, Mangum, and tell Granbury what I told you. I delivered the order. Subsequently in the same article, this is Mangum still. Just as the two brigades were ready to move forward, however, just at sunset, Colonel Bostwick, the Assistant Inspector General of Cheatham's staff, rode up with an order from General Cheatham directing Cleburne to remain where he was and not to move upon the pike until further orders. His division thus remained there all night, a furlong from the pike, acting according to Mangum under orders from Cheatham. The culprit in this tale, of course, obviously is the Corps Commander, Frank Cheatham. There is another tantalizing possibility. Stephen D. Lee, who will be the subject of the talk we hear later this afternoon from Herman Hathaway, wrote a private letter to a friend in 1878 in which he recalled that night at Spring Hill. Now remember, Lee is not there personally, but here's what he writes. Hood's orders in inaugurating the Spring Hill movement were ample for any Corps commander, an implied indictment of Cheatham. But then he goes on to say that he had heard it said, though he does not say by whom, that, and I quote, Cheatham and Cleburne consulted and decided between themselves that no battle should be fought at night. Hence, they did not push their attack. In that same letter, Lee wrote that when Cleburne saw that the enemy had escaped, he remarked, "This is the first time I have ever disobeyed the spirit of my orders, and if God will forgive me, it shall be the last." Because Lee heard this rumor secondhand and could not attest to it personally, he told his correspondent, "You must not use this." This, of course, is what lawyers call hearsay. They can't use it, but historians do all the time. The question is, can we believe it? To me, it seems unlikely that Cheatham's decision was the result of a secret understanding between the two generals not to fight at night. But it is possible that in previous conversation, Cleburne had made some reference to the difficulty of night fighting. He had some experience with that at Chickamauga, where his division was badly cut up in night fighting in thick woods, and he preferred to fight when he could see, especially when advancing over unknown terrain. It is at least possible, therefore, that Cheatham, remembering such a conversation, took it upon himself to send Cleburne and Bate on Cleburne's left orders to halt at sunset. The next morning, however, Cleburne rode from Spring Hill to Franklin in a very somber mood. Whether or not he held himself responsible for the escape of the enemy, as Lee's post-war letter suggests, he soon found out that others held him to be at fault. Cheatham told Cleburne about Hood's fury at breakfast in the Nat Shears house that morning. And worse yet, Cheatham told him that Hood blamed them for the lapse. As his troops marched toward Franklin, Cleburne rode ahead alongside the marching column to see what the other division commander, Major General John C. Brown, had heard about this. He found Brown sitting quietly astride his horse alongside the turnpike, and the two men rode away from the road so as to be out of earshot from the line of marching men, and they could talk together. Brown then informed Cleburne that, it had been a very volatile breakfast that morning, that Hood had been in the famous line that everyone knows, wrathy as a rattlesnake. Cleburne asked him what Hood had said. And Brown told him that Hood had merely emphasized the importance of a vigorous pursuit, a message with an implied criticism, but that he had not specifically mentioned the errors of the night before. Brown suggested perhaps Cleburne had misunderstood what Cheatham had told him. No, Cleburne replied tersely, I think not. We can imagine then, here we are again, we can imagine Cleburne's mood as he rode on toward that low line of hills just south of Franklin. As conscientious as he was, as important as his public reputation was to him, he could barely tolerate the idea that his superiors believed that he had done less than his full duty. He met with Hood in the Harrison House, just south of Breezy Hill. Cheatham and Brown were there too, as was Nathan Bedford Forrest and Alexander Stewart. Hood told his generals of his plans for the attack. Both Forrest and Cheatham were inclined to argue with him, but Cleburne did not. When the meeting ended, all the generals went out onto the porch. According to Learned Magnum, who was riding up just at that time, Hood hobbled out as well to give Cleburne some last-minute instructions. Form your division to the right of the pike, Hood told him. Give orders to your men not to fire a gun until you run the Yankee skirmish line from behind the first line of works. Then press and shoot them in their backs as they run to their main line. Then charge the enemy's works. Now, according to Mangum, Cleburne looked directly at Hood, and in the only comment he made at that meeting, said, I will either take the enemy's works or fall in the attempt. When he arrived at his division's bivouac, he gave orders to his 3 brigade commanders. One of them, Daniel Govan, thought Cleburne looked despondent, and noticed it particularly because Cleburne was usually so animated prior to going into battle. And sobered by that, he sought to engage Cleburne in a conversation. Well, General, he said, there will not be many of us that get back to Arkansas. Whereupon Cleburne, without smiling, responded, well, Govan, if we are to die, let us die like men. Hood was right about one thing. The Yankees had no intention of making a stand at Franklin. After his miraculous escape at Spring Hill, Schofield wanted only to get his army safely across the Harpeth River as quickly as possible. But whatever his intentions had been, they now bent to necessity as roughly 20,000 Confederates advanced on his lines. In roughly the center of that advancing line, Patrick Cleburne rode purposefully on a brown mare that he had borrowed from a staff officer to replace the injured Red Pepper, whose hip had been injured and therefore could not participate in the attack. He kept the mare reined in to keep pace with the advance of his 3 brigades on foot. His head turned constantly right to left, pacing his division's advance to match that of the divisions on either flank, Bates and Brown with Cheatham's other 2 divisions on the left, French, Walthall, and Loring of Stewart's corps on his right. In front of his own 3 brigades, there was mostly open ground broken only by one small copse of beech trees, half of them felled. Whatever grim resolution he may have made to himself on the road from Spring Hill, he could not fail to be stirred by such an awe-inspiring martial display. Nowhere else in the war, including, as we've heard, Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, did such a large force attack in precision order over open ground. Cleburne guided his division in an unerring straight line, using the Franklin and Columbia Turnpike on the left of Granbury's brigade as his guide. Federal batteries had opened fire almost as soon as his troops stepped into the open, and their fire tore holes in his advancing line, but company and regimental officers ordered the men to close up and fill the gaps, and the advance continued. There were very few Confederate guns available to support the attack. Only 2 batteries had followed from Columbia. They opened up, unlimbered in the open field behind Stewart's men, and fired over the heads of the attackers. Some of the shells fell upon the enemy soldiers crouching in that advanced line on this piece of high ground where we stopped the bus yesterday in the middle of that thick traffic. In the low depression just in front of that, Cleburne rose up in the stirrups to shout an order to halt. He recalled the skirmishers, deployed his brigades from column into line, all the while under fire, and then the charge began in earnest. 50 yards from the advanced Federal line, the Yankees delivered a full volley into the faces of Granbury's brigade, but the panting Texans hardly paused to reply. Ululating the rebel yell, they charged a gentle rise and assailed the enemy with the bayonet. The object of this furious assault was the Federal brigade of Colonel Joseph Conrad, with a literary name, about 2,000 Midwesterners from Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. They had watched the advancing storm with mounting disbelief and considerable anger that they had been left out in front in this exposed position to take the brunt of an attack by what looked to them like the whole Confederate army. Now with that enemy upon them, they broke. The advanced Federal line dissolved as men peeled back from the line so quickly that one witness was reminded of a fuse burning down. With little regard for unit integrity, they simply turned and ran. Cleburne-Soldier stopped only long enough to fire a telling volley into the backs of their foes before running after them. Watching from horseback, Cleburne urged them on. It was Brown, apparently, who called out above the din, "We will go into the works with them." Cleburne repeated the cry, and it spread through the ranks, "Go into the works with them." And then it became a race. 4,000 fleeing Federals pursued by 8,000 or 10,000 pursuing Confederates. The slowest of the bluecoats was soon overtaken by the fleetest of the attackers, and the mass of running men became intermingled. Union soldiers watching the race from the main defensive line outside the city withheld their fire for fear of hitting their own troops. But they could not wait forever, lest they themselves be overwhelmed. Cleburne, still mounted, spurred ahead into the mass of men, charging diagonally across the front of his own brigade toward the gap in the center of the Union line. In mid-canter, his brown mare went down heavily, nose first, killed by rifle fire. Picking himself up from the ground, he called for another horse. A staff officer, Lieutenant James Brandon, rode up and dismounted quickly, offering the reins to Cleburne. He had one foot in the stirrup when this horse, too, fell dead. Dropping the reins, Cleburne drew his sword, and waving it over his head, he charged forward on foot now towards the Yankees' line, where he could see the men of his command clambering over the earthworks. Granbury's Texans and Govan's Arkansans had reached the enemy main line. The blue divisional flag flew atop the parapets. This was the moment when victory and defeat hung precariously in the balance. Cleburne ran toward the spot, perhaps adding his own shouts to the general cacophony of noise. He was about 50 yards short of his goal when a single enemy bullet hit him in the chest, penetrated to his heart, and killed him instantly. Based on what I saw yesterday when we stopped, he must have fallen, ironically as it seems to say it now, roughly where the Pizza Hut stands today. The fight, of course, went on without it. The men of Granbury's and Govan's brigade seized a battery of Federal guns adjacent to the turnpike and attempted to turn them around, but the Union gunners had taken out the primers, and the guns couldn't be fired. Meanwhile, the Yankees organized a counterattack spearheaded by Opdyke's brigade. The Confederates met that counterattack head-on. The fighting became furious and hand-to-hand. In the thick of that fight, Granbury was shot just below his right eye, the bullet passing through his brain and exploding out the back of his head. Like Cleburne, he died instantly. Opdyke's charge staunched the breach in the Federal lines, but the rebels did not fall back because they could not fall back. They clung tenaciously to the outside of the Federal entrenchments. Those daring enough to try to resume the attack by clambering over the top either fell back dead or were grabbed and pulled over to be made prisoner. Separated only by the width of the earthworks, the two sides fired blindly over the top or through the space below the headlogs, their rifles sometimes overlapping each other. "We kept getting over," one Arkansas veteran recalled, "but they would reinforce and drive us out." After a while, the Arkansans agreed to wait and collect their strength until Cleburne gave them the order to go over the top all at once. "We waited and we waited and we waited," the veteran remembered, "and we wondered why Cleburne didn't give the order. When it didn't come, I knew Pat Cleburne was dead, for if he had been living, he would have given us that order." As twilight turned to full darkness, a darkness punctuated now only by frequent muzzle flashes, the two sides fought beyond the point of exhaustion. Finally, at about 10 o'clock, the firing died down, and in the darkness, both sides drew back from that berm of blood-soaked earth. For the second night in a row, Schofield's men slipped away in the darkness and plodded northward. Pat Cleburne knew none of this. He lay where he had fallen, though sometime during the night some barefoot soldier had taken his boots and another his sword. Dawn revealed that the enemy had fled, but it also exposed the extent of the butchery. The ditch in front of the Federal lines was literally filled with bodies, the dead, the dying, those so horribly wounded they could not drag themselves away. Dawn also revealed Cleburne's body. The word spread quickly through the army. Of course, Cleburne was not the only general officer to fall in that fight, but he was the best known and the most revered. Some seemed reluctant to believe it, as if Cleburne were invulnerable to death. A soldier of the 1st Missouri recalled that men said, "Why, Cleburne is killed," as if such a thing were quite literally incredible. They appeared to doubt it, he wrote later, as if such a calamity could not befall the army. Perhaps that was the moment, almost literally, that marked the death knell of the Army of Tennessee. Thank you very much. Okay, questions, please. Yes?
Dr. Craig, I consider this a tremendous opportunity. And if you don't mind, I'd like to make some comments and ask you questions. Whether you like it or not, what you're becoming is part of a very small group of people called Irish Confederate historians. And I believe that you don't have to be crazy to be an Irish Confederate historian, but it does help.
I'll keep that in mind.
What you described with Cleburne as far as his ethnicity is very typically Southern Irish. When I go to places like this, people will ask me two questions. Number one, how many Irish-born general officers were there in the Confederate Army? My answer is 6. The second question is, who were they? My answer is always, one of them was Pat Cleburne, and the other 5 weren't. You did mention, however, that being Irish and Protestant is unusual, but it was certainly not unusual in the South. For instance, of those 6 Irish-born Confederate generals, in fact, all 6 are Protestant. there are 34 general officers in the Confederate Army who are either Irish immigrants themselves, sons of Irish immigrants, grandsons of Irish immigrants, and with one exception, they were all Protestants. The one exception, Harry T. Hayes of the 1st Louisiana Brigade, had been born in the North. What she described as the immigration pattern was very typical of the Southern Irish. They had a little bit more money. They got off the boat at New Orleans. They worked their way up the Mississippi River, and they settled in communities. They became very thoroughly American Irish. There wasn't any of them at all in the Fenian movement. They were not fighting for that Ireland. They were fighting to stay with the homeland. About a month from now, Dr. Thomas Philip Tucker will come out with a book that's called The Irish Confederates, Forgotten Celtic Warriors and Brave. And in his introduction, he's going to point out some of the very strong differences between the Union Irish and the Confederate Irish. We now know that there were probably between 7,500 and 9,000 Irish-born soldiers in the Confederate Army. Guys all the way from Major Dick Dowling, who was an Irish Catholic Houston bartender from County Galway, who was the hero of Sabine Pass, all the way to Stonewall Jackson's aide, Henry Pitt Douglas, the son of a Presbyterian minister, who had been born in County Antrim. My question is this, because your book will be so important, will you be able to put Pat Cleburne in the context of other Irish Confederates so that your readers don't go away with the impression that indeed Pat Cleburne was the only Irish Confederate Army?
Yeah, very good question. Probably not, the answer to your question is probably not to the extent that would satisfy you. The way I've organized the book so far, and of course like all works in progress, subject to further revision, but I have about a 30-page chapter on Pat Cleburne's Ireland, where I try to bring in precisely those issues as much as I can. And the focus is clearly on Cleburne and his experiences. He was from County Cork.
One of the other Irish generals was also...
Yeah. And County Cork was heavily Catholic. It was about 2.5% to 3% Protestant. So they really did stand out in that area as different. And particularly at a time when, of course, there was agitation taking place for the Irishmen to vote. It's still part of the British Union, of course, and they were looking for opportunities to vote. And Cleburne's father, who was a medical doctor, was known locally as one of the reformers who supported the idea of allowing Catholic emancipation, Catholics for voting and so forth, supported the local candidate who was an advocate for Catholic emancipation. So to that extent, yes, I'm trying to put him in the context of his time and place, but I have not planned up until now, and after further conversation with you, I could change my mind, of making him part of Irish generals in America, because I'm interested in him personally. I mean, it's important, of course, to put any individual within a context broad enough to give the reader some sense of where that person is. But my book is on Pat Cleburne rather than on Irish generals. So I will look for as much context as I need to have to put him clearly in that context.
Your answer is very satisfactory, and I'm delighted about it, and I look forward to reading the book. And I think it's an important book for the simple reason, for many reasons, one of which will pinpoint the fact that there were Irishmen in the Confederate Army, and that in fact, even though Pat Cleburne was the best and highest ranking of them, in many respects, he was very typical of the Southern Irish.
Yes?
Two questions. One, I've heard that Pat Cleburne's sword and other artifacts were turned up in Mobile. You knew that was true? And
I'm sorry, go ahead. I don't know. I mean, I've heard the same thing.
The picture and echoes of glory of his sword.
Yeah, I don't know if that's accurate or not.
Now, the other question was, did his brothers or sisters leave anything that would help you?
No, apparently not. And if they did, it's never been discovered. I've talked to as many collateral descendants as I could. He, of course, left no direct heirs. He did not marry, although he was engaged at the time of his death. He had 3 full siblings and 4 half-siblings, one of whom was Kit Cleburne, who also did not survive the war, Christopher Cleburne, the youngest half-brother. I had some correspondence with Thomas Claiborne Jordan, who lived in Minneapolis and had 1 or 2 papers, but they had been made available to the Purdue's when they did their biography and are printed in there. So as far as I know, I think all extant writings of collateral descendants have been identified. So the difficulty that I have is not that I've got new information on Pat Cleburne that nobody else has had. All I can really do is try to grab the small little bits of observations made by others and try to form them into a kind of a mosaic, a pointillist mosaic almost, because they're tiny dots, and you have to, in connecting the dots is, as I say, a dangerous game. But the short answer to your question is I have no new information. I don't know if that sword is the sword that was taken from him at the battlefield. One story is that the sword, the presentation sword, he never took with him in the battle. He left that behind, and that's the sword. The sword he carried at Franklin has never turned up. And I'm inclined to think that's probably accurate. Yeah.
Do you recall what General Hood said in his book, Advancing Retreat, about...
Yes, I do. And do I believe it?
What did he say?
Well, what he says is that after this tale that I just described, where he comes out onto the porch and says, shoot them and so on, the Cleburne goes off, and he gives instructions to his brigadiers, and then he comes back 20 minutes later, and he says, General Hood, I just want you to know that I have never been so fierce in my loyalty to you and to the cause, and my optimism has never been higher than it is now, that our cause will triumph eventually, and I don't think you're the crack-brained idiot that your detractors say you are. And then he went off and died. So 15 years later, Hood recalls this event, you see, and puts it into his memoir as if to show that he was right and that his detractors, and especially that awful Joseph E. Johnston, was wrong. Do I think this happened? I'm of 2 minds about this. My first instinct was to say, oh, Hood made this up. Right, come on, he never came back. This is nonsense. But on the other hand, the more I think about how Cleburne might have reacted, it's possible that he did come back. I mean, here's Cleburne who hears that morning that Hood believes he's guilty. But Hood never told him that to his face. He hears it from Cheatham. And he's never had his confrontation. In the Harrison house, when he receives his orders, he says nothing, according to the other participants who were there. So here's his chance, eye to eye, to say to Hood, if you think I'm the guy that let down on the job, I want you to know I'm not that kind of guy, right? I still believe. I will still do my best. That may have happened. What I'm pretty sure did not happen was that he then said, and I think you're a great general, General Hood. That I don't think happened. But did Cleburne come back and talk to him? Possibly. There are no witnesses. None of Hood's aides, aide-de-camp, adjutant, general, inspector. Nobody else saw this. Only Hood and the dead Cleburne. So if it happened, I don't think it happened exactly the way that Hood describes it. Yes? Uh-oh, this is going to be hard. You'll have to speak up. I suspect not. He got into politics somewhat reluctantly. I think he adopted public speaking as a Mason and subsequently as an advocate of the anti-know-nothing movement in Arkansas. I think his public speaking as a Mason was very hard for him, and he forced himself to do it because it was a way to acculturate himself, become part of the society he wanted to join. It was a real effort. He's a shy person by nature. He became a public speaker. His first political speech, by the way, it was supposed to be Hinman. Hinman had organized this rally and then had to leave. He had a death in the family, and let's, oh, wow, you can do that, he says to Pat Cleburne. You can almost imagine, oh, my Lord. And he got up and gave this public speech, a very sincere, I mean, not the impassioned, fiery oratory that Hinman would have offered, but a very sincere, quiet presentation that, according to friendly newspapers, was very effective, and according to opposition newspapers, was limp dish rag. But I think he was in politics out of a sense of necessity and a sense of purpose. I don't think he liked it. I think he wanted social prominence, but not necessarily political prominence. I can see him becoming an effective lawyer, an important person in society, But if your question is, would he have been the, who's the governor of Maine? Yes, of the Confederacy, and become governor of Arkansas? I think probably not. But then again, I have no idea, really.
One more question.
No more questions. Okay.